Thank you for your patience. So the total national popular vote cast in 1916 exceeded that of 1912 by 3.5 million. The very large total vote was an indication of an aroused public interest in the campaign. It was larger in every section, notably in the East North Central section. Some of this was due to the extension of suffrage to women in individual states. In Illinois, for example, the total vote was 1 million greater than in 1912. So how did Illinois women get to this point? Let's go back a bit. Before women received the right to vote, they were considered second-class citizens. They had limited rights and privileges and were beholden to their husbands. A case in point, in the portrait and biographical album for Lake County, Illinois, each man's church and political affiliations are listed, but only the wife's faith is given and in combination with her husband. And here's an example of Mark Bing's profile from Wakanda. In politics, he was a Whig and cast his first presidential vote for William Henry Harrison. Both he and his wife are faithful members of the Baptist Church of Wakanda. So the 1818 Illinois Constitution gave voting rights to white male inhabitants above the age of 21 years. And the 1848 Constitution allowed men to vote for a greater number of officials than previously, but still women were not allowed to vote. In 1855, the first documented speech in Illinois in favor of women's suffrage was delivered by Mr. A.J. Grover, editor of the Earlville Transcript. The speech was inspired by Susan Hoxie Richardson, who was a cousin, the speech inspired Susie Hoxie Richardson, a cousin of Susan B. Anthony, to organize the first women's suffrage society in Illinois. The anti-slavery movement of the early 1800s spurred progressive-minded women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to begin a women's rights movement. In 1848, Stanton held a convention in Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss the, quote, social, civil, and religious rights of women. Susan B. Anthony joined the movement in 1850. 1848 convention generally considered official beginning of the women's suffrage movement. During the Civil War, women took on more responsibility in the household, managing money and becoming more involved in public affairs. Some early suffragists turned towards the war relief. For example, the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War. In Illinois, abolitionists Mary Livermore and Jane Hoge, both board members of the Chicago Home for the Friendless, were appointed co-directors of the Northwestern branch of the Sanitary Commission, a relief agency which provided supplies to soldiers and operated battlefield hospitals. During the war, Mary became, quote, aware that a large portion of the nation's work was badly done or not done at all, because women was not recognized as a factor in the political world. Although originally opposed to votes for women, the war convinced Livermore that men and women should stand shoulder to shoulder, equal before the law, and that suffrage was the way for the enactment of social reforms that she felt were needed. Between 1860 and 1890, there were gains in a specific women's rights. They got control of their earnings, equal guardianship of children after divorce. They were able to control and maintain property and get a share in a deceased husband's estate. After the war, Mary Livermore organized an Illinois Women's Suffrage Convention in Chicago in 1869. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton spoke, and the Illinois Women's Suffrage Association was formed. Livermore was elected president. Livermore moved to Massachusetts in 1870, so others had to take up the banner. The decade of the 1870s saw some movement for Illinois women to hold public office. In 1873, Illinois law allowed any woman, married or single, who possessed the qualification required of men to be eligible for any school office in Illinois created by law and not the Constitution. In November 1874, 10 women were elected as county superintendents of schools, even though they couldn't vote for themselves. Perhaps the most famous reformer of the period is Frances Willard. A big issue behind women's suffrage was the temperance movement. Many women thought that giving women the ballot was the only way to get rid of the demon spirits, ruining the American family. Frances Willard was the driving force of this movement. She lived in Evanston. She served as president of the College for Ladies and later dean of women at Northwestern University. In 1874, she resigned and went into the temperance business full-time. She established the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In 1877 and 1879, Willard presented petitions to General Assembly asking for a home protection bill, which would provide local option control of liquor sales and the ability for women to vote in these referenda. The bill was defeated, but Frances Willard became the first woman ever to stand at the speaker's podium and address an official session of the Illinois General Assembly. Another step forward. In June 19, 1891, women got limited franchise rights. They were allowed to vote at any election held to elect school officials, but there were still separate ballots and separate ballot boxes because other elections were often held at the same time. Although Libertyville claims to have the first woman to vote in Illinois, Lombard, Illinois would beg to differ. Earlier in 1891, Lombard resident Ellen Martin and friends made a bold move. Although suffrage was restricted to men in Illinois at the time, Lombard was governed by its pre-1870 compact, which omitted any mention of gender. The Lombard town charter stated that all citizens above 21 could vote in municipal elections. On April 6, 1891, Ellen Martin, wearing 2 sets of spectacles and a gripsack, went to the polling place with 14 other prominent women. The voting judges were flabbergasted by Miss Martin. Quote, "Mr. Marquardt was taken with a spasm. Reber leaned stiff against the wall, and Vance fell backward into the flour barrel." A county judge eventually proclaimed the legitimacy of the women's votes, which became the first women's votes tabulated in Illinois history. Thus, the argument that Ellen Martin was the first woman in Illinois to vote, just a few months before the Illinois provision for women to vote in school official elections. However, the men of Lombard quickly reorganized the town charter in line with the state law so that women thereafter were only allowed to vote in school elections. After 1900, more and more women's clubs and labor organizations endorsed some form of women's suffrage legislation. Between 1902 and 1906, the Illinois Federation of Women's Clubs endorsed several municipal suffrage bills. National organizations such as the American Women's League set up local chapter houses in North Chicago and Zion. The American Women's League worked to advance, protect, and uplift American womanhood and spun off into the American Women's Republic, which educated women about government in preparation for when they had the right to vote. In 1910, a suffrage barnstorming tour made its way to Lake County. The tour was arranged by a leading activist, Grace Wilbur Trout, president of the Chicago Political Equity League. Trout was accompanied by Mrs. Catherine Waugh McCullough, the law partner of her husband, Mrs. Ella F. Stewart, president of the Illinois Suffrage Association, and Miss Grace Nichols, corresponding secretary of the State Association. There were 4 women speakers, 2 reporters, 16 towns through 7 counties in 5 days. The women kept an aggressive schedule. On Monday, they visited Evanston, Highland Park, Lake Forest, and Waukegan. Tuesday, Grays Lake, McHenry, and Woodstock. Wednesday, Marengo, Belvedere, and Sycamore. Thursday, Geneva, Elgin, and Aurora. And on Friday, Naperville, Wheaton, and back to Chicago. The tour was covered in the local paper, so Libertyville women were likely aware of it. The closest stops were at Lake Forest, Waukegan, and Grays Lake. And while we don't know if any Libertyville women were in attendance, they certainly could have been there. At the Lake Forest stop, about 50 women and 10 men met the Women's Suffragist Automobile Party at the Art Institute lawn Monday afternoon and listened to the speeches. The audience was not the sort to satisfy some of the speakers, so they came uptown and tried to corral an audience from the 6 o'clock train, but with small success. Lake Forest is not strong on the suffragist movement. The Chicago Tribune went on to say that methods were bordering on the militant. It was a spirited assault on the Millionaire's Special, the name for the train car coming up from Chicago, and they forced 200 prominent Lake Foresters to listen. In Waukegan, the women speakers left a good impression. They were considered not the theatrical type and a charming party of women. They spoke to 200 to 300 people on the county courthouse steps, and also a few of the women went out to street corners to speak. They read letters from mayors in states where women already had the vote, and everything about that was good. There was less bribery, better officials were elected, and women voted for law and order. In Grays Lake, the women were lauded as bright and able speakers to a small but appreciative crowd. The organizer and leader of the tour, Grace Wilbur Trout, continued to lead the movement after the tour. Trout was president of the Chicago Political Equality League during the tour and became president of the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association in 1912. Trout was less confrontational as president of the state organization and started focusing on creating local organizations and lobbying individual legislators. In 1913, the Illinois General Assembly introduced a bill providing women the ability to vote for presidential electors and some local officials and local option elections. The bill was helped along by first-term Illinois Speaker of the House, William B. McKinley, but he stated that he would only bring the bill up for a final vote if he was convinced that there was sentiment for the bill throughout the state. Trout mobilized. McKinley was in Chicago over a weekend and received a phone call every 15 minutes, day and night, in support of the bill. He was welcomed back to Springfield by a deluge of telegrams and letters. The bill passed the Senate first, and it came up in the House in June 11, 1913. Grace Trout and troops literally fetched needed men from their residences and guarded the door at the House, urging supporters not to leave before the vote. The bill passed 83 to 58. On June 26, 1913, Governor Edward F. Dunn, seated, of Illinois, signed the suffrage bill that gave Illinois women expanded franchise rights. Governor Dunn signed the bill in the presence of his wife at the left and suffragette leaders Grace Wilbur Trout, Elizabeth Booth, female lawyer Antoinette Funk, and teachers union leader Margaret Haley. Women were now allowed to vote in elections for president, other offices not governed by the state constitution, and local option elections. The new law made Illinois the first state east of the Mississippi River to grant women the right to vote for president of the United States. And on this map, this shading, white states had full suffrage in 1913. Shaded states offered partial suffrage. Dotted states, women could vote for presidential elections and partial county and state suffrage. And in black states, women still did not have the right to vote. While they could vote for some things, women in Illinois could still not vote for governor, state legislature, state House and Senate representatives, congressmen, state officials, and not most county officials. However, it did give women a much stronger say in their local communities. So how was the bill received locally? Well, our local state representatives, 2 voted for the bill. 1 was present but did not vote. When the Royal Neighbors of Gurnee asked over 300 women present at a meeting that they had who was in favor, only 10 to 12 women of that 300 said they were in favor of the bill. There were 14 chapters present at this meeting, including Libertyville's. As luck would have it, Libertyville already had an election on the calendar. An election held earlier in the year, for men only, on a bond issue to build a new village hall had been negated due to a technicality. The election had been rescheduled for July 5th. At issue, a new village hall. A few quotes from the newspaper about the state of the existing building. Quote, "For years, the people, not the village board, have tolerated a veritable fire trap for human beings in their public lockup. It's an old wooden shanty called Lockup Fire Station and Village Hall. It is not surprising that women would be interested in this election as it revolves around social reform. The newspaper reported, many of them, Libertyville women, are already entering into their new privilege with keen interest and have already started campaigning for women as a whole believe the village needs a new hall badly. Quote, several well-known women have already displayed proclivities of campaigning and a knowledge of politics, which is surprising the men. And already the latter has started to sit up and take notice of the 200 or so new voters on the women's side, which may be found in the village. It is felt the solid vote of the women will go in favor of the bond issue. But at least the paper sounded proud. It is seen that Lake County again is in the front ranks in this important event, that of holding this first election in the state wherein women will cast their ballot under the new women's suffrage law. 34 women voted for and 23 against the bond. Mrs. Wayne Colby was the first to vote and, quote, several men stepped aside to give her precedence. Mrs. Colby said, I'm a very happy woman to have had this opportunity. The Chicago Tribune ran the article and photos you see here. Reminiscing in an article many decades later, Mrs. Colby's son stated that photographers asked Mrs. Colby to go back to the polls to take the photos, and that the laundry photos were likely staged. However, the paper noted that Clara's husband, Wayne Colby, was very proud of her. He was quoted as saying, just to show that it is not such a terrible thing for a man to stay at home and do the housework on the occasional voting day. After returning home briefly, Clara Colby went back out to encourage more women to vote. She spoke to women, including Mrs. E.H. Smith, the dentist's wife, on the street, telling them, do go and vote. I don't care if you vote in favor of the new hall or against. Just go to the polls and show the men that you are interested enough in the ballot to use it. Mrs. Smith shook her head and glanced coldly at her advisor. And Mrs. Colby said, well, there are plenty of women who do take interest, and they are going to give this town a thorough awakening. The vote was picked up in newspapers across the country, but generally the focus is on Mr. Colby and his willingness to do the laundry. So with this background established, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the women we know voted that day, starting with Clara Colby. Clara Averill was born in 1878 to Charles and Laura Averill of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Clara graduated from the Department of Elocution at the Chicago College of Music and Education and taught in Libertyville schools. For many years, she was the drama coach at Libertyville Township High School. Clara lived with her parents, who had come to Libertyville in 1887, until the age of 27, when she married Wayne Colby, a prominent lawyer and eventual mayor of Libertyville, in 1905. They had one son, John. Clara was a founding member of the Alpha Club, later the Libertyville Women's Club, and she served 2 terms as president of the club. She assisted in the organization of the Libertyville PTA. She passed away in Linwood, California in 1962 and is buried at Lakeside Cemetery in Libertyville. But who were some of the other women that voted that day? In addition to the wash tub photos, the Tribune also ran this photo. Left to right, we have Gertrude Mowers, Lemoyne Stafford, Marie O'Connor, Mrs. R.J. Chamberlain, and Mrs. R.P. Schnabel. And also in the middle, not in my notes, is Mabel McGuffin. Mabel Peck McGuffin was born in Ottawa, Kansas, to parents F.B. and Emily Peck. She attended Ottawa University, studying piano and musical theory. She came to Libertyville sometime after graduation and taught languages for at least 1 year at the high school. Mabel married Paul McGuffin on August 12, 1908, and they had 2 children, Lorraine and John. Mabel was referred to as a, quote, suffrage agitator in the 1913 election coverage. She served a 2-year term as the director of the library board, as a director on the library board, excuse me. She was president of the Alpha Club from 1910 to 1911, active with the First Methodist Episcopal Church of Libertyville, where she served as a member of the Board of Stewards. She moved to Seattle in 1945 after Paul's death to be near her daughter Lorraine. She passed away in December 1979 at the age of 95. She also is buried in Lakeside Cemetery in Libertyville. Caroline Schnabel, seen here on the left, was born in 1864 on a farm near Long Grove, Illinois. She married Robert P. Schnabel at the Long Grove Evangelical Church in 1884. Robert served as mayor of Libertyville from 1912 to 1916, so he was mayor of Libertyville at the time of this momentous vote. They had two children, Della and Austin. She had moved to Libertyville about 1906, and they built a home at 316 South Stewart Avenue that still stands today. She was active in the Rebeccas and passed in 1944 and is buried at Ivanhoe Cemetery. Della Albertina Schnabel Chamberlain is the daughter of our previous voter. She was born October 17th, 1889, and she worked as a laborer at a duster factory, probably the W.C. Holt Manufacturing Company in Libertyville. She married Roy Chamberlain on October 26, 1912. The couple had two children, Evelyn and Kenneth. She passed away December 25th, 1984 at Winchester House and is buried in Ivanhoe Cemetery. Now, the other three women pictured in that photo in the Tribune likely did not vote that day. The new voting law applied to women 21 and over, and each of them were just a little bit too young. But since they showed up, I'm going to give them their due. Lemoyne Stafford Kelly was the daughter of pickle manufacturer Richard W. Stafford and his wife, Marcia Evans Stafford. The Stafford house stood at the corner of Milwaukee Avenue and Park Avenue. Lemoyne married Gordon Kelly in 1915 and moved to Lake Forest. They had two children, Gordon L. Kelly and Stafford W. Kelly. For a time, she worked as an assistant manager of Garnet's department store in Lake Forest and Highland Park. She was a member of the First Presbyterian Church of Lake Forest and a founding member of the Lake Forest Lake Bluff Historical Society, which is today the History Center of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff. One of the other young women that showed up that day was Gertrude Mowers McDermott. She was born in Half Day to Peter and Barbara Maurer and moved to Libertyville in 1905. She married Albert P. McDermott on January 1st, 1914. She moved to Waukegan, where they lived for over 50 years. They had three children, Esther Jane, Albert Jr., and Rita. And she passed away in 1972 and is interred at Extension Cemetery. So we don't know very much about a lot of these women, and we know absolutely nothing more about Marie O'Connor, with a very common name and possibly having married. I was not able to locate her. But we do know that she was enthusiastic about the opportunity to vote, as you can see by the quote here. This was in the newspaper coverage of that day. A crowd of girls came running breathlessly into the voting place. They had just heard that women were voting, and they all decided to try the novelty. "I'm afraid you won't be able to show you are 21, said Mayor Schnabel to Miss Marie O'Connor. "Why, certainly we are not 21, but we are 18 and of age," replied the young woman with a haughty stare and a stamp of her foot. "When I do this presentation in person, I stamp my foot." The not pictured in the Chicago Tribune, the second woman to vote that day was Lena Corlett. Lena was 20 minutes behind Clara Colby. Her husband, Earl, was one of the election clerks. She was born in 1882 in Leroy, Minnesota, the daughter of Edgar and Elizabeth Wells. She moved to Libertyville sometime before 1900. She was married to Earl Corlett in 1905, and they had one daughter, Roma. She served as matron of the Libertyville chapter number 483 of the Order of the Eastern Star, which is a relation to the Masons. She was trustee of the Presbyterian Church, and she was on the building committee for the new church building that was constructed in 1927. She passed away in 1964. Also not pictured, but she was quoted in the newspaper, was Daisy Edgar Morse. Daisy went against her husband's wishes to exercise her new rights that July 1913. "My husband told me not to vote, but you see I am here," said Daisy, who headed a delegation of half a dozen women who applied for ballots. She was born in 1876 in Clayton, Iowa, to Xavier and Catherine Egger. She worked as a nurse at St. Joseph Hospital in St. Paul, Minnesota. She moved to Libertyville in 1898 to live with her brother, Henry Egger. She married J. Morse June 15, 1899. After a short time living in Hartley, Iowa, the couple returned to Libertyville, where J. Morse operated a clothing store. He served as Libertyville mayor from 1917 to 1923, Lake County clerk from 1938 to 1950, and county treasurer from 1927 to 1938. They had two daughters, Vera and Catherine. The organizational meeting for the Alpha Club that I mentioned earlier was held in Daisy's home in April 1903, and she served as president from 1911 to 1912. She was a member of the Liberal Chapter 438 of the Order of the Eastern Star, a member of the Libertyville Township High School Board in the 1920s, and vice president of the Libertyville PTA in 1917. Another woman that's identified is Grace Cater Gridley, who was not mentioned in the 1913 news coverage, but was included in a retrospective article in the 1959 in Waukegan News Sun. She was born August 14, 1889 in Libertyville. She was valedictorian of the first class to have a 4-year accredited high school course. This is before the building of the Brainerd Building. In 1911, she graduated from Northwestern University. She joined the Alpha Club in 1911, and she served 3 terms as president. She also got married to G. Carroll Gridley in October of 1911, and they had 3 daughters. She was a member of the first Libertyville Township High School Board and the first president of the Libertyville PTA. In the 1920s, she served on the Libertyville Library Board, and she was secretary of the first Township Library Board. Now, in the past, this is where my presentation would have skipped to sort of the conclusion. But just a couple of weeks ago, I was going through some files in the Historical Society archives, and I came across another newspaper clipping covering this election from the Chicago Examiner. It was quite a find, as it identified 8 more women who cast their votes in this historic election. And even though I don't have much information on them, I'd like to at least introduce them to you. So moving from left to right, to the far left is Mrs. Edith Grummett Wells, age 52. She's passing her ballot to her son-in-law, Earl Corlett. So this is Lena Wells Corlett's mother. So she was Lena Wells Corlett's mother, and she has 6 other children as well. She was a charter member of the Presbyterian Church Ladies Aid Organization and of the local chapter of the Royal Neighbors of America. She was also a past president of the Rebeccas, which is an affiliate of the Oddfellows. She lived on Newberry. Next, behind her is Emma F. Cleveland, age 51, who moved to Libertyville about 1900 with her husband, Frank G. Cleveland, a railroad engineer. Emma was a member of the Eastern Star and a charter member of the Grand International Auxiliary, the auxiliary of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. Her daughter, Mrs. Warren W. Grummett, must be some relation to Edith Grummett Wells. Emma lived on Newberry. Mary Pritchard, age 45, lived on Apley Avenue with her husband Richard, also an engineer on the railroad. The Pritchards moved to Milwaukee around 1915. Moving to the right, the young woman with the white shirt leaning slightly forward. At the age of 22, Ms. Hazel Small was just old enough to vote. She would become a nurse at Jane McAllister Hospital, later Victory Hospital in Waukegan, and she lived on Newberry. You might start to hear a theme here. Next is Alice Davis, age 48. She was living on her own in Newberry Avenue, the 1913 city directory. Although she's identified as a Mrs. in the caption for this photo, she never married. She was born and lived in Libertyville most of her life and supported herself as a vocal and instrumental music instructor. She was the sister of Martha Protein, who ran a millinery shop on Milwaukee Avenue. Unfortunately, she suffered from a heart ailment and passed away in October 1913, just months after participating in the election. Behind her is Adele Andrews, age 56. She was a member of the Ray family from Diamond Lake, where she lived for many years before moving to Libertyville with her husband Marcus and 4 children. She lived on Newberry. Outside of this picture, but in the original newspaper article, you can also see Mrs. O.J. Carlson, is identified, but I think she is probably Mrs. J.O. Carlson, the wife of the owner of the Ideal Laundry at the corner of First and Newberry. Matilda, who was 53 at the time, came to the U.S. from her native Sweden in 1885 and was naturalized in 1890. And finally, Pearl Ling, age 30, lived on Newberry with her husband Charles, who worked at the Folds Macaroni Company, along with her young son William. So did you pick up on the theme? All but one of the women pictured lived on Newberry Avenue. So although this photo was taken in the 1950s, this is Newberry dead-ending into what is today the American Legion, but at the time was the Libertyville Township Hall, where the election took place. And I put this picture here because I can just imagine this group of women going door to door, encouraging their neighbors to join them as they walk down Newberry to cast their vote at the town hall. So was Libertyville a hotbed of suffragist movements? There really wasn't much coverage of any local suffragist activity in the local newspapers, but I would argue that the Alpha Club was definitely an incubator. Said Clara Colby in the newspaper during the coverage, there are probably twice as many women in Libertyville as there are men. And while we have no regular suffrage organization, our literary club has discussed the question very thoroughly, and we have many ardent suffragists. And if you can remember, Mabel McGuffin was called a suffrage agitator in newspaper coverage. I also see the Alpha Club as an incubator. Their motto was progress and unity. Its object shall be a mutual improvement of its members in literature, art, science, and the vital interest of the day. In the Historical Society, we have a collection of their programs, which were published each year, which had a list of the meetings that they had and the speaker topics or the discussion topics that they had. And through those, you can see in the years leading up to 1913, they discussed social issues such as housing the poor, unemployment, settlements, prison reform, and women's property rights. So the Alpha Club started as a literary club in 1903 with the intention to form a physical culture club. There were just 6 women present, but they promised to each bring 3 friends to a meeting the following week. And at that meeting, it was decided they would be a study or literary club with a membership limited to 25. That first year, they used the American course of the Bayview Reading Club as the basis of the year's study. So they would read books and discuss things like American literature, history of the United States. A topic was called Awakening a Nation, Mexico, and so on. Looking at annual programs in the collection, you can see an evolution from the study of texts to papers and discussions on social issues, such as at their May 14th, 1913 meeting, there was one of them gave a paper on women's suffrage. In 1916, state laws with which we should be familiar, franchise for women and why limited in Illinois. Later that year, political party platforms of the presidential candidates. And then in 1920, the why of the militant suffragist. The only other hint that Libertyville was talking about suffrage was a spring 1913 high school debate where the topic was women's suffrage should be established throughout the US, yes or no. Elsie Weisskopf argued in the affirmative. Madeline Zook argued in the negative. I don't know if the sides were assigned or chosen, but the panel of judges, 1 boy and 2 girls, voted unanimously in favor of the negative side. Now you should know that Madeline Zook was valedictorian that year, so she must have been a very persuasive speaker. So 57 out of the 400 eligible women voted at that Libertyville election. Mrs. Trout, Grace Trout, who we met earlier, said that the vote at Libertyville demonstrates the need of educating our women in Illinois to a larger attendance at the polls. The experience in Libertyville makes me want to raise a fund for educational propaganda. Interest in the vote definitely grew in Libertyville, and it intersected with the ongoing temperance issue. In 1914, Libertyville had a wet or dry vote. Citizens sprang to action. At a citizenship meeting at the Methodist Church, ladies were invited to learn more about the voting process and listen to a speaker explain the relation of citizenship to the temperance cause. Dr. A.H. Churchill permitted his office to be used for the preparation of literature for mailing. Said one young woman stuffing envelopes, "If the town goes dry, we girls ought to get quite a bit of credit for it, and I think the newspaper should say so too." It did not say whether she stomped her foot, but I kind of imagine that she did. The dry forces did not rest on election day, April 7th. A thorough canvass was made of the county districts. Cars, surreys, buses, and single rigs were used to bring farmers and their wives to town to vote. The ladies' rest and instruction room in the Yachting Bakery building was besieged all day by women seeking direction on how to mark ballots. In that case, I don't mean how to vote yes or no, but how to actually mark the ballot, instructions on how to do that. At the end of the day, liberal voters had spoken. The vote fell out along gender lines. Women voting dry, 312. Women voting wet, 137. Men voting dry, 341. Men voting wet, 402. So the total dry vote was 653. The total wet vote, 539. Libertyville became a dry town by a 114 vote majority. Had women not voted in this election, the men's votes would have assured Libertyville remained a wet town. In a 1916 wet dry election, Libertyville's prohibition was reconfirmed. So at last, on June 10th, 1919, Illinois became the first state to approve the 19th Amendment. Ratification by the 36th state, Tennessee, came 12 months later. And the 19th Amendment to the Constitution took effect on August 26, 1920. This made the US the 27th country to allow women universal suffrage. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am happy to take questions at this time. Well, I'm glad to know that my presentation was very clear. So I'm still hold out if there's any questions here. I do see earlier there's a question about will you have access to the recording? Yes, the recordings are the recordings are published on the Historical Society's YouTube channel. That will probably be tomorrow or later this week. When were Black women, women of color, able to vote? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that locally, and I'm actually not really familiar with the 1919 law, whether they were, I would assume they were not allowed to vote in that 1919 law, and that would have come later, but I'm not positive about that. I don't know if there's anybody else on the call who has more information on that. There's a question you mentioned in 1848, men were allowed to vote for a greater number of officials. Who was voting for those officials before? I would have to go back and look at my notes. I don't know off the top of my head. I feel like it might have been, this is just a guess, that there were certain, it could have been state versus national. That always seemed to be an issue, but I shouldn't guess. I don't know off the top of my head. What type of registration or rules took place? There was no coverage of that in the in the paper. It pretty much said that Clara Colby just walked up and asked for a ballot. But I don't have any details on that. So you all have really good questions I don't know the answers for. I apologize. Okay. I think we have a pause, long enough pause that there might not be any other questions coming in. All right. I will send out a link to the recording when it's posted so that everyone can access it. I will also see if I can, in the meantime, look further into these questions so that when I send out the link to the video, you will all get the answers to them if I've been able to find the answers. It'd be always a good thing to look into and see if I can find out any more information on these specific questions. So the questions I have are: when were Black women, women of color able to vote? The difference in 1848 about which officials men could vote for and what they couldn't vote for, and what type of registration or rules took place for those women to be able to vote on that day. Great. Well, I appreciate your attention, especially on this beautiful day. Generally in March, I'm telling you, welcome to one of our spring programs, and it's not very spring-like. Today was gorgeous, and I appreciate you taking the time to sit in front of your computer when it's been such a great day. So if there are no further questions, once again, thank you for attending. I will send out the video link in the next day or so, and we hope to see you in April at the Libertyville Boys Boxing Club presentation. All right, thank you and have a great evening.